In the 14th century, the world was alive. A world of faith, of kingdoms, of burgeoning cities, and then it died. A great and terrible silence fell over the land. They called it the Great Mortality, a pestilence that came from the east, carried on the whispers of the wind. In the face of this apocalypse, their prayers went unanswered. Their God was silent. It killed 200 million people, half the population of Europe. It was the single greatest catastrophe in human history. But what they didn't know is that this death was not an end. It was a beginning. If you're ready to discover the shocking secret of how the Black Death created our modern world, subscribe now. The apocalypse begins. Our story begins not in the crowded cities of Europe, but here, in the vast silent grasslands of Central Asia, a seemingly peaceful and empty world. A world teeming with small life, like the marmot. But on this creature lived another smaller creature, the flea. And inside this flea lived the true monster of our story, a microscopic jewel-like bacterium, Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. For centuries, it lived in a stable cycle. But a changing climate forced the marmots, the fleas, and the plague into contact with humans. A single bite was all it took. The spark had found its kindling. The shadow began to move. And to travel, the plague found the greatest superhighway of the ancient world, the Silk Road. It traveled silently, an invisible passenger of death, hiding amongst the priceless silks and spices of the caravans. It found a new vehicle, the Black Rat, a perfect host that thrived in the filth of medieval trade. In the great oasis cities where the whole world came to trade, the rats disembarked, and the plague found 1,000 new victims. It spread with terrifying speed, an unstoppable black tide, flowing west along the very arteries that gave the world its wealth and knowledge. Finally, after a journey of 1,000 miles, it arrived at the edge of Europe, the bustling, fortified port city of Kaffa. In 1347, the city of Kaffa was under siege by the Mongol army of the Golden Horde. But the Mongol army was itself under siege from the plague. Their soldiers were dying in droves. Facing defeat, the Mongol commander, Johnny Beg, made a decision of unparalleled and terrifying genius. He would turn his dead into a weapon. His men loaded the plague-ridden corpses of their comrades onto their catapults. The first recorded act of biological warfare. And they launched the apocalypse over the walls. Inside the city, the merchants looked on in horror. They had no idea that death itself had just been delivered to their doorstep. From the hell of Kaffa, a handful of Genoese ships escaped, fleeing back towards the safety of Europe. But they were not alone. Hidden in their cargo aboard the Black Rats, the plague was a silent and patient passenger. By the time the ships reached the port of Messina in Sicily, they were not trading vessels. They were floating coffins. The horrified port authorities tried to turn them away, but it was too late. The rats had already come ashore. The apocalypse had arrived in Europe. From the ports, it exploded, spreading with terrifying speed along the trade routes, a black tide of death consuming everything in its path. The great cities of Europe fell silent. The streets, once bustling with life, became empty boulevards for the dead. The plague did not discriminate. It took the rich and the poor, the sinner and the saint. No king's castle was high enough to keep the shadow out. In their terror, people flocked to the churches, begging God for salvation. But their prayers were met with a deafening divine silence. Their faith was shattered. Their science was useless. The most learned doctors of the age, with their strange masks and useless potions, were as helpless as children. There was no cure, no explanation, only death on a scale so vast it was impossible to comprehend. In just 5 years, the entire social and psychological structure of the medieval world had been broken. In the face of the apocalypse, society fractured into extremes. Some, like the flagellants, turned to fanaticism and self-punishment, believing the end was nigh. Others, believing there was no tomorrow, plunged into a final hedonistic frenzy. The dance of death. All the old rules of class, of religion, of honor were rendered meaningless in the face of universal death. With no one left to work the fields, the very foundation of the feudal system, the bond between lord and serf simply dissolved. And in that collapse, something new and unexpected was born. For the few who survived, their lives and their labor suddenly had immense value. The old world was dead, completely and utterly, but from its ashes, the seeds of a new world, a world of individual worth and new possibilities, were beginning to take root. The plague had broken the world, but in that breaking it created a new one. The foundation of the old world, feudalism, was built on an endless supply of cheap labor. But after half the population died, a new reality emerged. For the first time in centuries, the common laborer was rare, and what is rare is valuable. Survivors could demand higher wages, better conditions, even their freedom. The chains of serfdom, which had bound Europe for 1,000 years, began to shatter. A new middle class of artisans and merchants rose from the ashes, accumulating wealth and power that had once been the sole right of the nobility. The rigid, immovable pyramid of the medieval world was turned upside down. Power was no longer based only on land and blood. It was now based on skill, ambition, and coin. The first seeds of capitalism were sown in the graveyard of the plague. The church, which had promised salvation but delivered only empty prayers, suffered a crisis of faith from which it would never fully recover. A generation that had seen the face of a silent God began to look for answers not in the heavens, but in the rediscovered wisdom of the ancient secular world. Art shifted its gaze from the stiff divine figures of the Middle Ages to the vibrant, dynamic, and flawed beauty of the human being. This was the birth of humanism, a revolutionary idea that the ultimate source of meaning, of beauty, and of potential was man himself. And this new confidence in human potential unleashed a torrent of creativity and innovation. Humanity, having survived the apocalypse, stood up, and for the first time saw itself not as a fallen creature, but as a creator in its own right. What followed was the Renaissance, an explosion of art, science, and genius that would define the modern age. A new confidence, a new curiosity drove explorers to seek new worlds beyond the horizon. And the printing press, born from this new hunger for knowledge, allowed ideas to spread faster than any plague. And this is the ultimate shocking paradox of our story, that the most beautiful flower in Western history, the Renaissance, could only grow from the soil fertilized by the greatest catastrophe. Was this unimaginable suffering the terrible price for the birth of our modern world? The Black Death left a scar on the soul of humanity, but from that scar grew a new kind of person, a survivor. The medieval mind, defined by faith and fear of the afterlife, was replaced by a new consciousness, one that valued the precious, fragile, and beautiful gift of life, here and now. With knowledge now accessible and social mobility now possible, the individual for the first time became the master of their own destiny. This was the birth of the Renaissance man, the ideal of human potential, a direct consequence of the plague's great reset. This new individualism fueled the birth of capitalism, as a new middle class, empowered by their own labor, reshaped the world's economy. The Renaissance was not a gentle awakening, it was a frantic, energetic, and brilliant explosion of creativity, born from the ashes of an apocalypse. Yet the memory of the plague never truly faded. The trauma was too deep. It echoed for centuries in their art, a constant morbid reminder of the fragility of life, the infamous dance of death. This is the ultimate paradox of the Black Death. The greatest catastrophe in history was also the greatest catalyst for change. Destruction and creation, two sides of the same coin. The medieval world had to die for the modern world to be born. And today, as we face our own modern plagues and global challenges, the story of the Black Death is not just history. It is a timeless and terrifying reminder of how fragile our world is, and of our incredible resilient capacity to rebuild, an eternal echo of genius.